The letter arrived at 6:30 in the morning, which was how Marin Ashwick knew it was not a courtesy. She had not yet lit the kitchen fire. She stood in the gray anteroom of the Ashwick house in her work dress, the one with the ink stain that would not come out at the left cuff, and she read the letter twice, and then a third time, because the words did not alter on the third reading the way she had hoped they might. She did not yet know what that letter would cost her. Had she known, she would have read it a fourth time and taken better notes. The letter was from the office of Aldrich Vane, Duke of Carstow, and it informed her, in the smooth, unhurried hand of a man who had never needed to raise his voice, that her father's debt to the Carstow estate had been called. The sum was not named. The sum did not need to be named. Marin knew it the way a farmer knows the size of a field she has walked every morning since childhood, 3,200 pounds, accrued across 11 years of failing harvests and optimistic drainage projects on the 40-acre Moor parcel that had once been her mother's pride and was now a waterlogged embarrassment north of the village. The letter stated that the Duke was prepared to forgive the debt in its entirety. The condition was one paragraph, stated plainly. His son required a wife before Michaelmas, and the Ashwick girl came recommended as a woman of sense. Michaelmas was 11 weeks away. Marin set the letter on the kitchen table and went to light the fire. She was 26. She had a younger sister who would need a dowry. She had a father whose optimism about drainage had survived 17 consecutive failures and showed no signs of diminishing. She had a gift for numbers that no one in her household found either remarkable or useful, and she had the kind of face that people forgot while they were still looking at it, which she had long since decided was one of the more practical faces a woman in her position could own. She lit the fire. She put the kettle on. She sat down and read the letter a fourth time after all. By the time her father came downstairs, she had her answer ready. It was yes. It was always going to be yes. The only question she had not yet resolved was whether the Duke's son knew what his father had purchased and what sort of man found that arrangement acceptable, and whether she would be able to keep her temper when she met him, which she considered unlikely. She arrived at Carstow Hall on a Tuesday in early July, when the heat pressed down on the limestone like a hand, and the lane into the estate was lined with lime trees that made the air smell faintly of something sweet going to rot. She came in a hired coach with one trunk and a satchel of her mother's botanical notes, which she had salvaged from the Moor farm, on the theory that they might prove useful, and on the theory, secondary, that they were the only thing left of her mother that had not yet been mortgaged. She was shown to a small sitting room and left there for 20 minutes, which she spent examining the room's account books, because the shelves held two of them alongside the decorative volumes, and they were not locked. She had them back in place before the door opened. The man who entered was not a footman. He was not, she thought, quite what she had constructed of him in 11 weeks of speculation. He was tall and broad in the way of a man who worked with his hands more than his rank required, with calloused palms, she noticed, because he did not wear gloves indoors, which was unusual. He had a serious face, not a cold one, the distinction being that a cold face withholds feeling to punish, while a serious face withholds feeling because it has learned that spending it is expensive and the returns uncertain. His name was Cass Vane, and he looked at her the way she had looked at the account books, with the particular attention of someone who is checking figures and not yet prepared to announce what they have found. He did not introduce himself. He said, "You were reading the household ledgers. The spines were cracked at the same page," Marin said. "Someone consults them regularly, and the room's been closed for company." I was curious what the recurring entry was. "It is the Northfield drainage contract." I thought it might be. There was a pause. It was the pause, she would learn, of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it. "Why," he said, "would you think that?" "Because I have a Moor farm with a drainage problem, and I know what those entries look like when they begin to compound." "Yours compounded 3 years ago. Whoever signed the Northfield contract either did not read the escalation clause or chose not to." She paused. "I should not have said that. I am sorry." "Don't be," Casvane said. He sat down across from her without asking her permission to be seated, which she found she did not mind. "Who signed it?" "The countersignature is a Mr. Emery Vane. I assume a relation." The stillness that came into his face then was not a new stillness. It was the stillness of a man who has been carrying a particular weight long enough that setting it down would feel suspicious. "My cousin," he said. "He manages the northern accounts." "Managed," Marin said, because the ledger entry had been dated 18 months prior, and nothing had followed it. "Or manages still?" Still, he looked at her with the level, slightly uncomfortable attention of a man recalibrating. "You read a ledger in 20 minutes and found the Northfield entry." I read quickly. "My father said you were a woman of sense. He did not specify what kind. The impractical kind, apparently, since I have agreed to this arrangement and cannot get the drainage on my own moor to work." His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was what a smile looks like when a face has mostly forgotten how. "The Moor farm," he said. "You know it. I grew up walking it. My mother kept botanical records of everything growing in the peat. I have her notes. I had some thoughts, for what they are worth, about the water table management, though I expect your estate drainage men will have better ones." "We do not currently have estate drainage men," he said. "We had one. He left with the Northfield contractor." He stood. "Will you walk with me?" It was not a request, exactly, but it was not an order. She had learned to read the distance between those two things. She stood and walked with him. The formal bargain was struck that afternoon in the estate library, with his father present, and a solicitor whose name she did not retain, because she was reading the solicitor's cuffs and deciding he was nervous, which was interesting. The terms were simple, and stated plainly by Casvane himself, which she had not expected: the debt forgiven, a jointure settled on her sister in addition to the expected settlements, a house in the village for her father, and the Moor farm returned to the Ashwick family name in trust. In exchange, marriage before Michaelmas. He read the list as though reciting a column of figures. She listened in the same register. When the solicitor left, the Duke left. Casvane stood at the window with his back to her, looking at the lime tree lane. "There is a thing," he said, "that I cannot yet lay before you." She waited. "Before Michaelmas," he said. "I will. I give you my word on it. That is a great deal of assurance for a man I have known 4 hours," Marin said. "It is the only kind I can offer." He turned from the window. "I want you to understand that the arrangement my father made is not the arrangement I would have made, given the choice. And what would you have arranged? I would have found someone who wanted to be here." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way it could have been said and not been intolerable. "I did not expect to find one." Marin looked at him for a long moment, the calloused hands, the careful face, the set of his shoulders that was the posture of a man standing in front of something he has positioned himself to take. "I do not know yet whether I want to be here," she said honestly. "But I should tell you that I am very difficult to be rid of once I have decided a problem is interesting." His mouth moved again. A fraction further this time. She went home to pack the rest of her trunk, and she did not let herself decide what that fraction meant. The house was introduced to her over the following week, by which she meant she introduced herself to it, while the house formed its opinions in private. The staff had been with Carstow a long time, with one exception, a steward named Emery Vane, the same cousin she had identified in the ledger, who managed the northern accounts and who came to call on the third day with a basket of hothouse fruit and a smile so steady and gentle that she counted the teeth in it the way a physician counts a pulse. He was perhaps 35, with fair hair and very clean hands, and the kind of beauty that had been maintained at some private cost she could not yet determine. He spoke to her of the estate's history, the Duke's health, Cass's long silences, and the peculiar demands of the Moor farm with the easy intimacy of a man laying out a room for her in advance, telling her which chairs were comfortable and which would not hold her. She thanked him. She watched him go. She then went to find Nell, who had been the housekeeper at Carstow for 31 years, and who greeted every new development in the estate's fortunes with the same expression a person wears upon biting into a plum and discovering it is a day past perfect. "Mr. Emery Vane," Marin said. Said Nell. "He manages the northern accounts." Among other things, Nell was folding linen with the aggressive precision of a woman who had strong opinions about linen and found the conversation distracting. He has managed a great many things over the years that were not precisely his to manage. Such as are not mine to say. Nell refolded a pillowcase that had already been folded. "I will say this much, and no more. There are people in this house who have been waiting a long time for someone to read a ledger in 20 minutes. She said it to the linen, not to Marin. Marin received it as intended and said nothing, which was one of the more useful skills she possessed. The Moor farm was a 40-minute ride north, and she went the following morning on a gray horse Cass Vane had assigned her without comment, which was the closest he had yet come to a gift. She had been to the farm 24 times since her mother died, each time hoping to find something her father had missed, each time finding instead new evidence of what standing water does to peat over time. She knew every drainage ditch, every sodden corner, every spot where her mother's records showed what the land had once grown before the water table climbed. She spent 4 hours walking the perimeter with her mother's notes. When she returned, Cass Vane was in the stable yard, the eastern field, she said, because she had not yet learned to build to conclusions with him and found she did not need to. The secondary ditch was dug in the wrong sequence. 30 years ago, someone diverted the upper channel to solve a flooding problem in the lane and never rerouted it. The water has been walking the long way around ever since. He looked at her. "You found that in 4 hours. My mother marked the original channel in her notes. I was standing on it this morning, and it took me some time to understand what I was standing on." She pulled the notebook from her satchel and opened it to the page. Her mother's hand was small and exact, the letters of a woman who had not wasted paper. "If you reroute the upper channel here, the eastern field drains in 1 season. Possibly 2. He took the notebook the way a man takes something he recognizes. He stood looking at the page with the stillness that was not coldness. "Your mother mapped this," he said, "every summer for 9 years before she died." Marin kept her voice flat. She was trying to solve it. She never had the capital for the rerouting work. "You have it now." He closed the notebook and gave it back carefully. "We will begin next week. I would rather begin this week." He looked at her. "This week," he said. He did not smile. But something in the set of his face shifted, and she filed that shift the way she filed a figure that wanted watching. The beginning of the drainage work brought the beginning of what she would later, privately, call the war of small distances. He arrived each morning at the farm a quarter hour after she did. He worked. He had, as she had noted, working hands, and he used them without apology or comment. The men digging the rerouting ditch addressed him as Your Grace, and him as the man handing them the leveling rod, and the two things seemed to cause him no difficulty. He told her very little about himself. She told him very little about herself. They talked about water tables and soil compaction and her mother's notes and the escalation clause in the Northfield contract, which she had reviewed from the ledger copy she had memorized on the first afternoon. He listened to her the way he looked at figures, without interruption, without performance, and with the quality of attention that is rare enough to be startling. On the fifth day, she arrived to find him already there, standing at the upper channel with 2 men and a length of rope, doing something she had described in theory and had not expected him to execute without her. "You started," she said. "I thought I had understood the measurement," he said, without turning. "I was wrong. Come and tell me where I was wrong." She came and told him. He listened, he adjusted. He did not thank her for it, and she did not expect him to, and the absence of the performance felt obscurely like trust. On the 8th day, it was Emery Vane who arrived at the farm. He came at midday, when Cass had gone back to the hall for an hour on estate business, and he came with the basket and smile manner of a social call. And he stood at the edge of the ditchwork and looked at what she had done and said, in his gentlest voice, the voice that was always its own soft threat, "You are transforming the place. I hope Cass has told you why it matters quite so much to him." "He has not," she said. She kept her eyes on the drainage line. "I expect he will, when it matters that I know." "Ah," Emery smiled. "He would not have told you then about the girl." She had not known there was a girl. She showed nothing. Her mother had taught her that too, not in words, but in the manner of a woman who had kept a difficult household running without ever letting anyone see the cost of the keeping. "He would not have told you," Emery continued, "because it reflects poorly on him, I think, in his own estimation. There was an arrangement before this one. A young woman from a good family, well-suited, everything proper. She broke the engagement. She said, and I only tell you because it is better you hear it from someone who cares for you both. She said he was a cold man, incapable of attachment, and that she pitied whoever came after. He said it with the expression of a man delivering news that distresses him. I only want you to know, so that you do not mistake his silences for something they are not." "That is very kind of you," she said. "Thank you." Emery Vane rode away with his empty basket, and she stood at the upper channel and thought about the stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and about what kind of silence belongs to someone who cannot attach, and what kind belongs to someone who has decided that spending feeling is expensive and the returns uncertain, and whether she had ever in her life confused those two things. She had not. That evening, Cass Vane came to the small sitting room where she had taken to spending her after-dinner hour with her mother's notebooks, and he sat down across from her and said without preamble, "Emery came to the farm today." "He did." "What did he say to you?" She looked up from the notebook. "He told me there was a previous arrangement, a broken engagement." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them sent its light up into his face and made the lines of it older and more honest. "There was," he said. "It is not a secret. He should not have told you in that way." "No." She agreed. "He shouldn't have." She turned a page. For what it is worth, I did not find the information alarming. I found his manner of delivering it more interesting than the information itself. The slight pause. The recalibration. "In what way interesting?" Cass said. "In the way," she said carefully, "that a man who tells you a thing gently, in private, with the basket still in his hand, is usually more interested in what you will feel than in whether you know, which makes me curious what he wanted me to feel." The lamp moved with the draught from the window. Cass Vane said nothing for a long moment. "Then I misjudged you, when you arrived." "In what direction?" "I thought you were a woman of sense in the ordinary way, good with figures, steady in a crisis, practical, he looked at her. You are those things. But that is not the sum of it. What is the sum of it? She kept her voice dry, because if she did not, she was not sure what it would be. I do not yet know, he said. That is the first honest thing I have told you that was not about drainage. She did not look up from the notebook. But something in her chest, which she had kept carefully stilled for 26 years, made a small, precise, unwilling sound, which she converted immediately into the turning of a page. Michaelmas was 5 weeks away, and she could feel it in every morning like the heat pressing down on limestone. The farm work advanced. The eastern field began, improbably, to show evidence of what her mother's notes had always insisted it could be, a meadow, in time, rich and firm underfoot, with the black Carstow cattle standing on it as though they had always stood there, and the water going sensibly where she directed it. She did not let herself love it yet. Loving things before they were established was the precise habit that had ruined her father, and she was not her father. What she let herself do, instead, was notice. She noticed the way Cass Vane carried a length of rope differently from the way he carried a ledger, the rope with an ease that the ledger did not give him, as though his body knew one kind of work better than his rank had expected. She noticed that he stopped twice a day to speak to Nell about the household, briefly and with real attention. She noticed that the stable boys laughed within earshot of him, which was not the behavior of boys who were afraid of a man, but of boys who had been treated, by that man, with consistent basic decency, and this was more diagnostic than any formal introduction could have been. She noticed, on a Wednesday 3 weeks before Michaelmas, that the kitchen accounts were wrong. She was not supposed to be reviewing the kitchen accounts. She had been given authority over the Moor farm's working expenses, and nothing else, and the kitchen accounts lived in a ledger on Emery Vane's shelves in the steward's room, which she had no reason to enter. She had entered it because Nell's housekeeper book was cross-referenced to a line in the kitchen accounts that did not balance, and the line that did not balance was for a monthly household provision, and the monthly household provision was almost certainly not £43. She stood in Emery Vane's office, at the desk he kept immaculate as a mirror, and turned the pages of the kitchen ledger with a feeling she had learned to name precisely and without fuss, the feeling of a floor that is not where the foot expects it. The first entry was 8 months ago. The provision had been £17 at that time, which was large but possible. It had risen by odd amounts, irregularly, in a pattern she recognized, not a thief's regular extraction, which creates a visible rhythm, but a careful person's careful disappearing, which uses irregularity the way a painter uses shadow, to make the eye slide past. She turned back to the previous year. The provision had been £11. Before that, 9. The escalation had begun not 8 months ago, but 11 months ago, which was almost exactly when the Northfield drainage contract had been signed. She replaced the ledger and left the room. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the lime trees in the heat, thinking about the Northfield escalation clause and the kitchen provision and the timing of both, and about a man who manages northern accounts and arrives with a basket and speaks in his gentlest voice. She thought, I need to see the Northfield contract in full. I need to see it before I say a word to anyone. She thought, I have 3 weeks. She went to find Nell. Nell listened to her with the expression of the plum that is a day past perfect, and then said, The contract is in the estate archive room. Mr. Emery Vane holds the key. Who else has a key? The Duke. Nell folded her hands. And the first solicitor who drew it, who has since retired to his sister's house in the north. The Duke, Marin repeated. He is unwell this week, a summer cold. He is not to be disturbed. Nell's gaze settled on a middle distance somewhere past Marin's shoulder. His room, however, connects to the archive room by an interior door that has not been locked in my memory, as the late Duchess used the archive for her correspondence. Marin looked at Nell. Nell looked at the middle distance. "Thank you," Marin said. "I have said nothing," Nell said, and went back to her linen. She found the Northfield contract at 11 o'clock that night, when the house was quiet and the Duke was sleeping, and she read it by the light of her candle in the archive room, with the particular attention of a woman who has been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this document. The escalation clause was worse than the ledger had suggested. It was not a drafting error. She had drafted enough of her father's contracts to know the difference between a clause that was poorly written and a clause that was written very well to do a particular thing. This clause was written to allow the Northfield contractor to increase his payment by up to 40% annually at his own discretion, subject only to written notice, and the written notice provision required notification to the steward rather than to the Duke or his legal representative, which meant that the 40% increase could proceed without the Duke ever knowing it had been invoked. The notice, dated 11 months ago, was tucked between the contract pages. The handwriting on the notice was Emery Vane's. The signature was something else. She held it to the candle and read it carefully, and then again, because the signature looked very much like Cass Vane's, except that it was not. She had read Cass Vane's hand enough by then to know the way he made his letters, the way the pen lifted slightly early at the close of a word, a habit she had noticed in his field notes and in the single brief letter he had written her before she arrived. This signature had the shape of his hand without its habits, which was the description of a forgery constructed by someone who had studied the original but did not possess it. She sat with that a moment. The candle guttered. She replaced the contract. She took the notice. She went back to her room and put the notice in her mother's satchel, which was the most defensible place she could think of, and then she sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she had, and what she still needed, and how much time she had, and what the probable shape of a trap set this carefully would look like when it closed, and who it was intended to close on. The answer to that last question was clear enough. The trap was intended to close on Cass Vane, and it had been closing slowly for 11 months, and the mechanism was the forged authorization, and she was going to need one more thing before she could spring it open in the other direction. And the thing she needed was a witness who had not yet decided which way to fall. She thought about the solicitor's nervous cuffs. She thought about the archive room key. She put her candle out and lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. And in the morning, she got up and went to the Moor farm and worked. Because the drainage did not stop for intrigue, and because working made her steady, and she needed to be steady now more than she had ever needed anything. It was the worst week she had spent at Carstow. Not because of Emery Vane, who continued to be gentle and present and attentive in a way she now read clearly as the attention of a man monitoring a variable he has not yet resolved. Not because of the Duke, who recovered from his cold and was gracious and vague in the way of a man whose trust has been so thoroughly occupied by someone close that he has no room left for doubt. But because of Cass Vane, who had begun, in those weeks of drainage work and evening ledger hours, and the occasional walk to the upper channel in the gray morning, to be legible to her in ways she had not planned for. She had planned for competence. She had planned for the working hands and the serious face and the silence that was armor, not coldness. She had not planned for the night he came to the small sitting room and sat across from her and said, "My mother planted the eastern meadow," and stopped, and she waited, and he said, "She died when I was 12. The meadow went to water 2 years later. My father never spoke of it. We have not spoken of it since." She had not planned for the way he said it, which was flatly, as though reporting a field measurement, which was the only way he knew how to say things that cost him. "I know," she said. "Your mother's name is in my mother's notes." They corresponded about the water table. He looked up. "Once," she said. 11 years ago, shortly before my mother died. My mother wrote to the Duchess of Carstow because she was the only other woman she knew who was trying to drain a moor in the north, and your mother wrote back." She opened her notebook to the last page where she had kept the letter folded small. "I have had it this whole time. I did not know how to give it to you." She held it out. He took it with the hand that was not quite steady and read it in the lamplight and did not speak for a long time, and she did not require him to. "I owe you something," he said finally. "You owe me nothing," she said. "It was hers. It belongs with you." He held it a moment more. "Then I made a promise. Before my Kelmus," I said, "there is a thing I have not told you, and I have been trying to find the moment. The right arrangement of words." She waited, because this was the right thing to do, and because she already suspected what was coming, and because it was going to be difficult to receive it without letting him see that she suspected, and she needed another week and could not afford to show her hand. The knock came before he could continue. A footman at the door with a message for the Duke that required an answer. Cass Vane rose, and the moment dissolved like a figure in ledger ink when rain comes through a window, and she let it go, because she had learned long ago that the way out of a trap was through the middle of it, in the light, with people watching. And she was not yet ready to go through. She needed the solicitor. His name was a Mr. Orrin Foss, and he had retired to his sister's house, and she wrote to him on the 8th day before Michaelmas, which was a Tuesday, on a state paper that she used with the authority of the woman who would be its mistress in 8 days, and she said that she had found an anomaly in the Northfield contract that required clarification before the Duke signed the annual estate review, and that his presence in 3 days would be very much appreciated, and that she was sorry to disturb his retirement and would compensate his time. Mr. Foss arrived on the Friday. He was a thin man of perhaps 65, with a careful face and careful clothes and the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime managing other people's important papers and had developed, over that lifetime, a condition she recognized, the chronic alertness of someone who knows where the bodies are buried but has convinced himself, through sustained practice, that knowing is not the same as complicity. She met him alone in the library. She put the notice on the table between them. She said, "I would like you to compare this signature to Mr. Cass Vane's own hand. I have 3 examples of his letters here." Mr. Foss looked at the notice. She watched his hands. They stilled, and then resumed their ordinary posture, and then stilled again, which was the sequence of a man making a decision. "I see the difficulty," he said. "Do you know the difficulty?" she said, which was not quite the same question, from before today. There was a very long pause. "I think," he said slowly, "that I should speak to the Duke." "I think so too," she said. "I would like you to do that on Monday. I would like it done in the presence of Mr. Cass Vane and of whatever additional witnesses seem appropriate, and I would like you to bring the original contract, which I understand is in the archive room, and I would like the archive room opened by the Duke rather than by the steward." She folded her hands on the table. "I am asking you to do this because you are the person in this situation with the least to lose and the most to give, Mr. Foss, and because I think you have been waiting for someone to ask you." Mr. Foss looked at the notice for a long time. He had a habit, she had noticed, of pressing his thumb to the inside of his opposite wrist, the way a man checks a pulse to reassure himself. He did this now. "Monday," he said. "Yes, she spent the weekend at the Moor farm. She did not tell Cass Vane what was coming. This was the hardest thing she had done at Carstow, harder than the archive room, harder than sitting with the letter she could not yet give him, harder than the 5 and 11 nights she had spent working out what she had and what she needed. Because he had been looking at her that week with the expression of a man who is building toward a question and has almost found the words, and she knew what the question was, and she could not let him ask it yet, because his asking would untether everything she was holding in place. On Sunday evening, Emery Vane came to the farm. He came at dusk, alone, without the basket, which told her the baseline had changed. He stood at the edge of the newly reclaimed eastern field and looked at it with an expression that was not admiration and not contempt, and after a moment he said, "You are very good at this." "Thank you," she said. "I meant the accounting," he said. "The farm is remarkable." "But I meant the accounting." She waited. "Someone has been to see Foss," he said. "He wrote to me," apologetically, which is worse than boldly. He looked at her without the smile. Underneath it, she saw what she had been waiting to see, the grief beat. The thing that had been there all along beneath the performance, the not-quite grief of a man who wanted the estate because he had grown up in its shadow and watched it pass him by every year for 35 years, and whose envy had calcified long ago into something indistinguishable from ownership in his own accounting. "I built this," he said quietly. "All of it. Everything that runs correctly in this household runs because of work I did when Cass was at school and his father was grieving and no one was watching. I am owed this." "I know," she said. She kept her voice level, because she did. She could see it clearly. The arithmetic of second place, tallied over decades, arriving at a sum that looked, from inside it, like justice. "I understand the account as you have kept it. I don't think it's wrong exactly. I think it is the wrong currency." He looked at her. "You spent 35 years, she said, and you are owed 35 years. But not this. Not a forged name on a notice that would have broken him." It would not have broken him. It would have cost him the estate. He would have survived it. "You don't know that." "No," he said, and there was something in his voice then that she had not expected. Not remorse, exactly, but the first quiet hemorrhage of certainty. "I don't." She said nothing more. He left before dark, and she stood in the eastern field until the light was gone, and she thought about the Northfield notice in her mother's satchel, and about Monday morning, and about the thing Cass Vane had been trying to say to her for 3 weeks, and she let herself know, for the first time, what she wanted the answer to be. Monday came the way the most important days always came, without announcement, with ordinary light and ordinary birds and the smell of the lime trees, and the sound of wheels on gravel that was the hired coach bringing Mr. Foss back to Carstow Hall at 9 in the morning. Marin had set it for 10 in the Duke's private study, with the Duke and Cass and the estate's attending magistrate, a man named Sir Aldous Prynne, who lived 4 miles away and had been apprised, the previous Friday, of the situation in carefully imprecise language that nonetheless conveyed the necessity of his attendance. Emery Vane was present. She had not arranged that. He had arranged it himself. She understood when she saw him standing beside the Duke's desk in his immaculate clothes and his immaculate face, that this was his own gambit to control the room from inside it, to manage the story before it could be told by someone else. He was, she thought, a very intelligent man whose intelligence had been entirely self-directed for 35 years, which was one of the more dangerous combinations she had encountered. She put her mother's satchel on the desk and took out the notice. She did not speak immediately. She had laid the contract on the desk, open to the escalation clause. She gave Mr. Foss a moment to find his footing, and he used it. He cleared his throat, and he said, to the Duke, in the voice of a man burning a document he had been sitting on for 11 months, the contract as drawn contains a notice provision that does not name the estate's principal as the required recipient of escalation notices. I should have flagged this when I drafted it. I did not. I ask your pardon for that, Your Grace. The Duke looked at the contract. His face was the face of an old man realizing that a room he thought he knew has a wall he has never examined. Marin put the notice beside the contract. She said, "This is the escalation notice, received 11 months ago." The signature reads as Mr. Casvain's. I have 3 authenticated samples of Mr. Casvain's handwriting here. She laid them beside it. You will see that the formation of the final stroke of his surname differs consistently between the authenticated samples and the notice. The authenticated samples show a characteristic early pen lift at the last consonant. The notice does not. She looked at Sir Aldous Prynne, who had been examining the papers with the attention of a man taking this seriously, which was why she had chosen him. I am not a handwriting examiner, Sir Aldous said, but I see what you are describing. He looked up at Emery Vane. Sir, do you have anything to add to this? The room was very quiet. The window was open, and the lime tree air came through it, and there were sparrows doing ordinary sparrow business in the eaves, and Marin stood at the desk with her hands flat on the polished wood and watched Emery Vane with the attention of her whole life. He was, she thought, a man who had run this particular possibility through his mind many times and had always arrived at the same answer, which was deny. But the answer had depended on there being nothing physical, and there was something physical, and it was on the desk in front of 3 witnesses, and the thing that happened to his face then was not what she had expected. It was not calculation. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding a story in place by main force for 11 months and has finally, in one precise instant, run out of force. I wrote the notice, he said. The contract clause was my design. The contractor agreed to share the extraction. He said it without dramatics, in a voice she had not heard from him before, tired and flat and younger than his face. I have been here since I was 18 years old. I did not think anyone would check the kitchen accounts. No, said Nell, who had been standing by the door in the unremarkable way of a housekeeper who is always by a door and whom everyone forgets. You never did think anyone would check. That was the error. The Duke had not spoken. He was looking at his nephew with an expression that Marin read as not betrayal, exactly, but the grief of a man who has understood, too slowly, that the room had a wall he had never examined, and that the examination was going to cost him something he had no remaining supply of. Emery Vane looked at the Duke, and his jaw moved once, and she saw in that movement the 18-year-old who had arrived here 35 years ago, and decided, somewhere along the way, that waiting to be enough was not a strategy he could sustain. Emery, Casvain said. He had not spoken since she began. He was standing at the window with his back to the lime trees, and his voice was quiet. Was there no way to ask? It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, and it was the most devastating thing said in that room, and Emery Vane had no answer for it that was not the truth, which was no. There had been a way to ask. He had not been able to make himself small enough to take it. He said, "No, I didn't think there was." The silence that followed was the silence of a room that has just heard something that cannot be argued with, and cannot be forgiven, and can only, with difficulty, be pitied. Sir Aldous Prynne dealt with the legal machinery without drama. The contractor's files were to be surrendered, the overpayments calculated and recovered, The notice declared void. He spoke to Emery Vane about the terms of his departure from the estate's service, that he would leave before the week was out, that a reference would be provided for appropriate positions, that the matter would be handled as a contractual dispute and not as a criminal proceeding, as the recovery of funds was judged adequate remedy by the estate's principal. "That is more than he warrants," the Duke said. He had found his voice again, and it was tired. "It is more than the situation requires," Casvane said, "and less than turning it into a public prosecution, which would cost the estate and the family more than the recovery is worth, and does not return the 11 months in any case." He looked at his father. "Let him go. Give him the reference, and let him go." The Duke looked at his son for a long time with the expression of a man realizing he has misjudged a measurement. Then he nodded. Emery Vane left the room. He paused at the door and looked back, once, at Marin, and she returned the look without arrangement, and he went. Sir Aldous Prynne left. Mr. Foss left, with a handshake from Casvane and a quiet word of thanks that she did not overhear. The Duke left slowly with his hand on the doorframe and said to Marin as he passed, "My son's judgment is better than mine." He did not make it a compliment. He made it a fact, which was better. And then it was just the two of them in the study, with the satchel on the desk and the sparrows in the eaves and the weight of the morning hanging in the lime tree air. Casvane stood at the window. He had not moved. "How long?" he said. "I found the kitchen account entry 3 weeks ago. The notice was in the archive room. I have been waiting for Mr. Foss. Why did you not tell me when you found it?" She considered this, "Because I needed 3 weeks, and I did not want to hand you half a thing. A half thing is worse than nothing. You would have gone to him directly, and he would have burned the notice, and there would have been nothing left but your word against his and the kitchen account, which is suggestive and not decisive." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I needed an object. I needed a witness. I needed the right room." "The way out is through the middle," he said. "In the light. With witnesses." Yes, he turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had looked at the ledger on the first afternoon, but it was not the same look. The first look had been the look of a man checking figures. This was the look of a man who has finished checking and found they are correct and is sitting with the weight of what that means. "I have been trying to tell you something," he said. "I know. I have been making a poor job of it." "Yes. The first arrangement, the broken engagement, I ended it. Not her. I ended it because I was not the man she deserved, and I knew it, and it seemed better to take the blame than to explain why I was wrong for her, which would have been unkind." He said this with the flatness of a field measurement. "I am telling you now because Emery told you his version, and I should have told you mine before that. You could not have known he would tell me. I could have told you sooner, regardless." He crossed the room and stopped in front of the desk, a distance away that was not formal, but was still considered. "I want to tell you the rest. The thing I have been building toward for 3 weeks. But I want to tell it to you plainly, so that you can answer plainly, and I want to be sure before I speak that you know what the stakes are." "Tell me the stakes." "The estate is whole," he said. "The debt is forgiven. Your sister's jointure and your father's house stand regardless of what you say to me now. I will put that in writing today if you wish it." She looked at him. "Then tell me the rest," he said. "I have been in this house for 35 years. I have not in that time wanted to come home to it. Not once. The last 3 months, he stopped. He squared his hands on the edge of the desk, the way he squared tools at the end of a workday, and tried again. I am not a man who finds words the natural instrument. You know this. The words I have are, I would like to marry you because you want to be here. Not because of the debt, not because it was arranged. I would not take that arrangement as an answer. He looked at her. Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take. Marin stood at the desk for a moment, with the satchel and the sparrows and the light moving on the floor, and thought about the way out of a trap and how it was through the middle of it, in the light, with people watching, and how sometimes the trap was not a trap at all, but a door that someone had badly explained. I have decided, she said, that this is a problem I find interesting. His mouth moved, further than it had ever moved before. It was, she noted, a beautiful thing to see, and she filed it the way she filed a figure she intended to revisit frequently. Then yes, she said. Because I wish it. The wedding was small. Nell wore her good dress and wept without apology, and the hired coachman who had brought Mr. Foss threw his hat up in the lane because someone had told the village, and the village had arrived anyway, the way villages do, in ones and twos, with flowers and opinions. The Duke stood very straight during the ceremony and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has finally understood a measurement he had been taking wrong for years. There was a moment, at the end, when Cass Vane handed Marin the talisman she did not yet know was hers, a small silver case with a latch, her mother's letter inside it, cleaned and mounted, with a note in his hand on the facing page that said, in his plain, careful letters, she was right about the channel. So were you. He had made the case himself, with working hands, in the months between the archive room and the wedding, which was the kind of gesture that is not an apology, and is not a declaration, and is both of those things, and something beyond them that does not have a name, but that a woman who reads faces can identify on sight. Mr. Foss was given a reference and a letter from Sir Aldous Prynne commending his candor. He was last heard of practicing in a quieter county, where he had reportedly become very particular about escalation clauses. Emery Vane went north, to his mother's people, with an allowance that Cass arranged, and that the Duke considered excessive, and that Marin considered proportionate to the weight of 35 years spent in a house that was not quite yours, earning a place that was always going to go to someone else. She did not say this aloud. She kept it, instead, as the private receipt of the cost of the happy ending, which she had promised herself she would not pretend was free. The Northfield contractor repaid £1,700 of the £3,240 extracted over 11 months, and negotiated the rest as a release from the contract, which was ultimately cheaper than litigation, and left everyone exactly as tired of the subject as it deserved. The drainage on the estate's northern properties was rerouted the following spring, using her mother's notes and Cass Vane's level rod and 2 new drainage men hired from the county, who were competent and who did not read escalation clauses the way she had taught the estate's solicitor to read them after that, which was, twice, and aloud, and to a second set of eyes. Marin's father had 3 good years on the Moor farm after the water table settled, and a 4th year that was excellent, and in the 5th year he attempted a drainage project on the western edge that she advised strongly against, and he proceeded anyway with his customary optimism about drainage, and the project failed, and he was entirely cheerful about it. Her sister was married in the autumn to a clergyman from the neighboring parish who was kind and read Latin and kept chickens, and whom everyone agreed was a better match than any amount of money could have arranged, and the jointure was eventually put toward a schoolhouse. Nell retired 2 years later at her own timing and on her own terms, to a cottage on the estate that had been hers from the moment she had stood by that study door and said what nobody else would say. And she accepted the arrangement with the dignity of someone who knows perfectly well they have earned it, and finds the offer approximately 11 years overdue. She received visitors on Tuesdays. She was formidable about the tea, the redeemable rival, a Miss Orla Clare, who had been the polished and well-positioned candidate of the season before Marin arrived, and who had made it her private project, through the summer, to compile evidence against Marin's character from sources that proved, on examination, to be entirely Emery vain, came to the hall in November of the first year, in the rain, and knocked, and was received. She said that she had been used, and she knew it, and she was sorry. She did not make it more than it was. Marin gave her tea and her honest assessment of where she had been wrong, which was simply and without cruelty, and she left with her head up. She married a captain the following spring and went to live in Portugal, and by all reports was very happy there, which was what she had always deserved, and what she might have been given a year sooner if the room had contained fewer people with things to protect. One morning in the June of the second year, a June that was warm and clear in the ordinary way of the season, without the pressing quality of that first July, the heat that had come in like a hand, Marin was walking the eastern meadow before breakfast. The grass was thick and dark-rooted and carrying the black cattle easily, and the upper channel ran the way she had understood it could run, and the skylarks were doing what skylarks do in a meadow that has been returned to itself. She heard footsteps behind her, the particular cadence of a man who walks a field the way he carries a rope, with the ease of a body that knows this ground now as its own. "You are up early," Cass Vane said. "I like it in the morning." She looked at the meadow. My mother wrote, in her last entry, that if the Eastern Channel were ever rerouted, this field would be good in 5 years. She did not expect to see it. She paused. She was wrong by about 4 years. He stood beside her. He did not say anything, which was the right response, and she had long since stopped cataloging his silences as data and started receiving them as what they were, the company of a man who understood that not every good thing needed to be explained. "Do you know what I found in the kitchen accounts this morning?" she said. "What? A line item for 24 lark's eggs, delivered weekly from the Henwick farm." She considered it. "We do not eat lark's eggs." "No," he said. "Someone ordered them 4 years ago, and no one canceled the order." "No," he said again. She looked at him. He was watching the skylarks with an expression that was almost entirely serious and approximately 3% something else, and she understood, with the precision she had always brought to figures that wanted watching, that the lark's eggs had been ordered by Emery Vane and canceled by no one, and were being delivered weekly to a household that did not want them, and were paid for out of a kitchen account that a woman who read ledgers in 20 minutes had eventually examined, and that Cass Vane had found this out some months ago and had not canceled the order because it was, in its small, absurd way, a thing that made her laugh, and he had decided, at some private moment she had not witnessed, that things that made her laugh were worth a certain budget. She looked back at the meadow. The skylarks were very busy. "Cancel the order," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "If you think it best," he said. She had known, she thought, since the morning of the letter. She had not let herself know that she knew, because knowing too early is the error that ruins accounts, and she was not a woman who made that error. She had kept it in the ledger under the heading of things that want watching, and she had watched it across 11 weeks and £3,200, and a 40-acre moor, and a forged signature, and a silver case, and a Tuesday in November, and 2 years of June mornings, and the figure had not changed, and she was ready now to post it. "Cass," she said. Yes, she did not say anything else. She took his hand, the calloused one, the working one, and held it, and they stood in the field her mother had always known could be good, and the skylarks went on with their business, because the world goes on with its business at the moments that matter most to us, and that, she thought, was not indifference but a kind of grace. If this story stayed with you, the water that finally ran where it was always meant to run, and the woman who knew it would, then you know the kind of tale we keep burning the lamp for here. Draw a chair close if you have not already. There is always something on the kettle, and the fire is laid. Tell me in the comments below, the moment you knew, was it the ledger read in 20 minutes? Or something quieter? We keep this hearth for the ones who read carefully and feel deeply, and if you would like a chair kept for you always, there is a way to arrange that, and it costs only one small click. Until we meet again by the fire, sleep well and be gentle with the ones who kept your channel running when you were not watching.